Hi everyone, this is Koinzell here. So today I'm bringing you guys the third math guide for Albedo Math Guide 3.0, which basically we are going to focus on Freedom Zone today for him, because we all know that Itto is going to be a super OP AF DPS, very broken, higher figures than what we are seeing on all the top tier DPS right now, thus far. And imagine if you use Freedom Zone to buff Itto's charge attacks, which is his main damage source. If you don't know how Freedom Zone works, let me just quickly run through it right now. Okay, so this is Freedom Zone. It is actually Kazuha's signature weapon, hence the EM substat. Base attack is not too bad, it's an average base attack for a 5-star weapon. At level 90 you get 608. R1, between R1 and R5, the main difference is that R1 increases the damage by 10% for the user, 20% for R5, but this is not the main dish. The main dish is the fact that when you trigger elemental reactions, you gain a sigil. When you gain 2 sigils, you will increase party members' normal, charge, and plunging attack by 16% and attack by 20%, and this applies to the entire team, which means that it applies to Goro as well. Okay, and you don't need to do like specific switching, which is the case with like Trillion Tales of Dragon Slayer. Okay. Now, R5 simply doubles this effect where the attack damage is 32% and attack is 40%. 32%, 40%. Now, the overall buff to Itto per se is not as effective as a attack skilling character, but the charge attack damage by 32% is still very nice. And in this video, I'm not gonna lie, Freedom Zone gave me quite a bit of headache because I had to think about how to optimize the rotations, alternatives for the rotations, how best to calculate and present the data for Freedom Zone. Which is the reason why it took me so long to in fact produce the Cinnabar Spindle video, because I was trying to make it follow the same format. I was trying to have all the videos follow the same format. So that's why from between the first Geo Artifact Albedo Math video, which is Math Guide 1.0 until Math Guide 1.1, it actually took me quite a number of days, because I reworked the entire data and the presentation of it. But I mean, that's just a bit of background for you. So this is Freedom Zone. How good is it for a character like Albedo, who doesn't really benefit from the EM? And only, how should I put it? Only benefit is once you use Freedom Zone, your only purpose is really just to buff Itto. Let me put it this way: when Albedo uses Freedom Zone, its damage is definitely going to be lower than Cinnabar Spindle, because it's even lower than Harbinger of Dawn for that matter. So now, okay, I did see some questions about the artifact stats, so I thought I should quickly at least run through the figures. So we are at a 60 and 170 target, with C6 Goro is 60 and 200, with a bit more defense. Now, you can also take those 2 rolls to get yourself more crit rate if you prefer a higher crit rate. But if you have seen my math videos thus far, you know my philosophy is, even though I do math and I average out all the crit figures, right, I do believe practical usage wise, 60 to 70 CRs is enough. Okay? Especially based on all the past experience with other gacha games that I've played so far. The only time I will go for high CR is when I can get 100% CR without sacrificing too much crit damage, aka Itto. Because RNG is a bitch. Okay? You can have 95% CR and you can still not crit 3 times in a row when you need the crit. That can happen. That is why I don't believe in getting a high CR until it's 100%. Between 60 to 70, a range of 60 to 70 all the way until 100, I personally would prefer investing in crit damage. That's my personal preference and experience. Now you have the defense figures here, or the actual damage figures with the Blossom, depending on how many stats of Husk you have and whether you have the A1 effect effective. Okay, but let's go on to the most important point, which is Albedo's E. Albedo's E snapshotting, we already know this, so because of this, we have to do a rotation. Let me share what is the Freedom Swan rotation. So this Freedom Swan rotation is different from the normal C2 rotation or hybrid rotation because we are focused on ensuring that we get the FS buff, which requires Albedo to trigger 2 of the elemental reactions before we start Itto's burst. So rather than maximizing Albedo's C2 effect, this is one thing I really dislike about his C2, which is the fact that you have to gain stacks. You have to use your elemental skill, the proc of it, to gain 4 stats. That's 8 freaking seconds before my burst can skill with its full defense potential. And that defense potential still is a waste against the high attack percentage that he has on his burst, the high attack modifier. So yeah, that's just me bitching about C2, but yeah, I don't like it. So in this rotation, I also managed to find an added benefit that is going to help us with the optimization. Now you saw in my previous videos, I always say that in order to focus on FS, getting FS buff, we have to only get may have to sacrifice and get only one C2 stack. Now I have good news for this rotation, because it's likely that we can get 2 C2 stacks. So this is the rotation for Freedom Swan. Flat slot, cast the burst, and/or skill, takes about 1 to 2 seconds depending on whether you are casting both. You start with flats, and right after that, you have Albedo E, and 1 with the E proc immediately for the first two Husk stacks, as well as your first reaction. That's the reason why we start with the flat slot, because we want to apply the element and for Albedo to proc the crystallize. Next, you have Goro E, just to give you a buff before you cast your Albedo burst. And you cast your Albedo burst plus a N1 to do an E proc. This is also the reason why I wanted to add in a Goro E 1 second here, so that we have a definite amount of time where we are sure that the E proc cooldown will be done. Because if you don't have that here, your E proc cooldown is not 100% done the moment your Albedo burst animation finish. Now I know that I said that it's almost 2 seconds, but it's not exactly 2 seconds, his burst animation. Which is the reason why if you spam your normal attack right after your burst animation ends, you may not proc the E proc. Of course, you can spend more time doing more normal attacks, but I'll rather just buff his burst in that case. Okay, and right after the N1 with the E proc, you can do a recast, and remember what I said in the previous video. Every time you recast, you do another N1. Okay, immediately procs E proc again. So this is the important that I want to talk about. The fact that we can basically throw in the N1 E proc here, and it does not actually change the 4 seconds that we use to calculate, because the time to wait for the 3 to 4 Fatal Blossoms to trigger coincides with your N1 animation time anyway. So this means an additional N1 E proc plus additional C2 stack, which is the Fatal Reckoning stack, worth of damage. This is pretty nice. Now, going by the same logic, you might think that my previous rotations can also use a N1 to trigger E proc before we cast, right after our burst, before a recast. But because the rotation is different, it's actually not guaranteed that you get an E proc. Basically, we are missing a Goro E 1 second here, which fallbacks to what I was talking about, where your burst is not exactly 2 seconds, and if you spend your normal attacks, your first normal attack may not trigger the E proc. Okay? But since you're going to be waiting for 3 to 4 Fatal Blossoms to trigger anyway, there's no harm to just smash your normal attack button. Right? So just smash it. So I have updated the rotations to include them as well. So see here, Albedo Burst, you add 1 N1 plus recast. For the C2 hybrid, likewise, add 1 N1 right after burst, before recast. Okay, so that's for rotation. And by the way, I did not include the E proc because like I said, it's not 100% guaranteed. You can spam your normal attack and wait until you get a Proc. It may be N2 or N3 before you get it, but personal preference up to you. It's just that, just bear in mind that it does prolong this. It will, if you do more than one normal attack, it will take you more than 4 seconds here, and your overall DPS will drop. Although technically speaking, since you're triggering another E-Proc, maybe it will help, but without doing the math, I can't be sure. And I don't have the time to go back and re-update this math because there's a lot more other math videos that I need to do. Okay, but at least I throw this out here, this suggestion here, so you guys can optimize it if you want to. Okay, now pure defense. You notice that I did not talk about pure defense. It's because it's not recommended to go pure defense for Freedom Zone. There is no way to reliably proc the 2 reactions even with free cast. And I'll cover this in more detail later. So let's talk about the standard artifact comparison. We'll talk about the artifact comparison coupled with Itto's damage. And then we'll do a weapon comparison for Freedom Zone versus Cinnabar Spindle. Featuring, it's all going to be 4-piece Husk, and I will do one for Albedo only, one for Albedo plus C6R5, and one for Albedo plus C0R1. Itto. And then we'll talk about whether Albedo burst is really required to proc the FS buff, as well as FS conflicting issues with Itto's design. And I'll do a final recommendation after that. Now I know that a lot of people may not have Freedom Zone to use with, given that Kazuha's banner was one of the lowest selling or lowest sales banner for miHoYo. Although I'm very sure that will change when Kazuha is back on his rerun banner, but we don't need to talk about that now. So first off, although most people may not have Freedom Zone, I think at least the sessions 5, 6, and 7 will be interesting to most players, since most players will be using Cinnabar Spindle. But before that, let me just talk about the best artifact set or the artifact comparison for Freedom Zone. Okay, so here you have 4-piece Husk versus 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk, R1 and R5 of Freedom Zone. Pretty straightforward, right? First 4 columns is R1 Freedom Zone. Second column is the next 4 columns are R5 Freedom Zone. So this is the total DPS, damage per second. You'll see that 4P Husk again does better, just like my other previous videos where we talk about with the need to recast E due to Snapshot, 4P Husk actually still does better, even with 3 or 4 stats. 3 stats if you are doing pure defense, 4 stats if you are not using your burst. 4 stats if you are using your burst, which is hybrid mode. The difference between 4-piece Husk and 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk for FS is 9 to 19%, which is lower than the 11 to 20% for Cinnabar Spindle, since Cinnabar Spindle buffs Albedo's E significantly. That's the reason why. Now, I just want to add one statement here, which is that the difference would have been bigger if we did not optimize the FS rotation to include one more N1 plus E Proc, plus the C2 stat as well, without extending the total time, because we managed to do that still within the 4 seconds. So that's a big reason why the percentage is still pretty close to Cinnabar Spindle in terms of the difference. But again, we know that we can't just look at Albedo when we are in an Itto team comp, because Itto's damage is so high. The setup time is too much of a setup time. Setup time is detrimental to your overall team DPS, because the longer you wait to use your Itto, who has majority of the damage in the team, the worse it is for your entire comp. I mean, his damage is so high that what I just said applies to most main DPS, but his damage is so high that it's very significant. Alright, now let's look at C6R5 Itto first. So pretty straightforward stuff, but this time round the damage is higher than what you see. Instead of 1.111 million, you see 1.33 million here, because we got the R5 FS buff. If it's a R1 FS buff, you get 1.22 million. Okay. Remember, this is only within Itto's burst duration, which is about 10 seconds of actual DPS time, because after you reduce the first second of the burst animation time, the remaining time, 10 seconds, is his actual DPS output. So this is very, very nice. But is it really good? We'll talk about that later when we do the weapon comparison. First off, let's focus on the artifact comparison. Okay, so this is 30 PS damage per second, which is really high by the way. But of course it's CC R5 alone with a R5 weapon buffing it, or at least a R1 of it. So these are the percentage figures. We are not going to talk about the no burst figure, because like I said, with Freedom Swan, you should be doing hybrid mode. You should not be doing pure defense. So naturally, in this case, right, 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk is better than 4-piece Husk by 1 to 2%. When you see a negative figure, it means that the 4-piece Husk is doing worse. Which is expected because we already established that the higher Itto's damage is, the worse of 4-piece Husk will fare against 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk in my previous videos. And now you're buffing his damage with Freedom Swan. So of course, 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk is better. Okay, now how about C0R1 Itto? When Itto is dealing about, let's see, 717k and 133. Almost half, not exactly half, almost half, maybe about 60%. As a rough estimate, I have not done the math. So since C0R1 does lesser damage than C6R5, 4-piece Husk performance improves over 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk. Where it is actually better than 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk at C2 by 1 to 2%, and worse than 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk at C0 with burst by 1%. Okay, do you see it is getting a bit reverse, where you have better figures on 4-piece Husk on some scenarios, or some specific permutations. So TLDR for artifact comparison wise, Albedo with C6R5 Itto, 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk is only 1% better at C2 and 2% better at C0 with burst, provided your Albedo E is not destroyed by enemies. I always have to repeat this, because the moment you have to recast on your 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk, you are 100% going to be worse off than 4-piece Husk. And I already shared that it's actually very easy for his E to be destroyed nowadays. So recasting is not necessarily a bad thing for 4-piece Husk. But it is a bad thing for 2-piece Husk because we are assuming that there's no need to recast. That's why the DPS figures are slightly better. Once you have to recast, it's GG. Okay? So Albedo with C0R1 Itto, 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk is actually 1 to 2% worse at C2. And only 1% better at C0 with burst. Again, provided your Albedo is not destroyed by enemies. So it's very, very marginal improvements, and in some cases, it's actually worse off. So without a top tier DPS like Itto, 4-piece Husk is actually 9 to 19% better. Okay, now that is for artifact. I will do one final recommendation to conclude. If 5 points for TLDR is too much for you, no worries about that. So first off, let's look at a very, very simplistic view. We'll just do weapon comparison for Freedom Swan versus Cinnabar Spindle with just Albedo's damage alone. But I think you guys will know what is the artifact set that I will recommend for Freedom Swan, seeing as I only compare with 4-piece Husk, right? Okay, anyway, so these are the damage figures. If you want to see like the absolute highest damage figure is here. So Freedom Swan R1 gives you 367k. This gives you, which is R5 Freedom Swan, gives you 383k. And Cinnabar Spindle at R5 gives you 460k. So obviously right off the bat you know that it's gonna do very well, Cinnabar Spindle. Look at all these percentages here. We are talking about like 30 plus, 20 plus. It's all at least a typical 4-star to 5-star weapon type of upgrade. Except that this is the other way around. This is a 4-star weapon doing better than the 5-star weapon. But to be fair, in the first place, Freedom Swan is a support weapon unless you are an EM sword user, example like Kazuha, because this weapon is a signature weapon. So for accurate comparison, we should include Itto's damage that is buffed by FS. Do you remember the figures I was talking about? We have 1.33 million with R5 Freedom Swarm buff versus 1.11 million without. And then you have 1.22 with the R1 Freedom Swarm buff. So let's look at the weapon comparison. It's a very big session because I really have to... How should I put it? I really have to permutate quite a bit. Okay. So if you look at the overall DPS, if I include Itto's buff damage, that's why you see that the damage now are all in million, 1 million plus damage here, because we included Itto's buffed FS buff damage along with Albedo's damage, rotation damage. So with that, right, you'll see that if you see negative figures, it means, okay, in this case it's a bit different. If you see negative figures, it means that Freedom Swarm is doing better than Cinnabar Spindle. So you notice that for a C6 R5 Itto, remember I always do the first highest permutation first. For C6 R5 Itto, even though you have 1.22 million damage buff over 1.1, which is additional 110k, if you look at the loss of damage for FF itself versus how high Cinnabar Spindle's damage is, R1 FS is only better by 1.4 to 2.5%. That's mind-blowing, because a 5-star weapon providing buff to the main DPS is only better by a 4-star weapon that is purely for that one of the sub DPS character, and is only better by 1.4 to 2.5%. 4-star versus 5-star weapon. Wow. But the narrative is a bit different for R5 Freedom Swarm, because R5 Freedom Swarm is better by 9 to 11%, so that's much better. But there's another caveat to this, which is that Freedom Swarm buff lasts for 12 seconds, and there's 20 seconds cooldown before the Sigils can be gained, which means other than the 8-second downtime between 20 and 12, you still have the amount of time required to get the Sigils, which is 2 elemental reactions. Okay, so technically speaking, it's more like 12 seconds downtime with 12 seconds uptime on a character like Albedo. For Kazuha, it's much faster because with one sword he can do 2 elemental reactions. That's how good Kazuha is, by the way. So this means that Freedom Swarm will only be ready on the 3rd Itto burst, not the 2nd. Even if you do not have C2 Itto. Because C2 Itto has much shorter downtime, right? Without C2 Itto, right, your downtime for Itto is 7 seconds. 7 seconds is still longer than 12 seconds. And the 7 seconds, even if I take a additional time for Goro's Q, which is what is recommended in my rotation, it's still 1 second plus 7 seconds, 8 seconds versus 12 seconds is still too long. Okay? But of course, this is assuming in the case of you are a content that does not need you to clear everything in one rotation and that you need to be in continuous combat. Yeah, but I'll talk more about that later. So I kind of have to talk about second rotation now, right? Because we say that Freedom Swarm is only ready every alternate burst, or Itto's burst. So I don't want to have to go to do the math for second rotation for CS and FS, because that requires me to think about the entire rotation, etc. Okay, but to simply put things into perspective, there's an easy way to do this. Since we know what is the buff figures, we know the damage difference between Cinnabar Spindle as well as FS. So this is C6R5 Itto. The actual FS damage buff for Itto is as follows. Okay, you have a 9.7% buff at R1 Freedom Swarm. You have a 19.6% buff at R5 Freedom Swarm. Okay, pretty straightforward, just double. So for FS to be better than CS in the long term, if you average out your rotations, if you just count throughout your entire dungeon run or something, the FS damage buff should be more than 2 times the difference between CS and FS, since your FS only buffs once per 2 rotation. This should be fairly easy to understand, right? Just double the difference, and your FS damage buff, as long as it's more than double difference, it will be better. FS will be better, okay, than using Cinnabar Spindle for your overall team DPS. Now, the figures here is our actual damage from the weapons. If I take the difference and I multiply it by 2, these are the figures. And I compare 2s difference versus the FS damage figures here. Ignore the yellow figures, that's a wrong formatting from previous permutation. Let me just do this. So the green figures represent the green highlighted cells. Okay, wait. There's something wrong with this. I was supposed to hide these 2 rows because I didn't want to talk about C0 burst. Okay, but anyway, it's fine. What I wanted to say here is that if you see the non-negative and the positive figures, you know which is better, right? Obviously, for this case, negative figures here refer to the R1 Freedom Zone, which means that your R1 Freedom Zone buff, the buff to Itto's damage, is not enough to compensate for the difference between losing out on the damage that Cinnabar Spindle provides if you factor in 2 rotations. Of course, there are other caveats to that 2 rotations. Don't worry, I'll talk about those. So in the long run, in the long term, as long as we average out rotations in pairs, R1 FS is actually worse off than R5 CS in terms of Albedo plus Itto's damage. Can we just take a second to think about how crazy that is? A R1 5-star weapon, a very very good weapon by the way. Freedom Zone is one of my favorite weapon in terms of the effects it provides. It's really strong. So R1 FS, one of the best support weapon, a 5-star weapon, is worth off than a 5-star free event weapon. Let that sink in. Okay, it's worse off than a 5-star event free weapon. Granted, Freedom Zone was not designed for Albedo to begin with. Okay. I don't know whether to call this a silver lining, is that R5 FS is better than R5 CS. And like I said, you should compare only the figures with burst, because you need to use burst with FS to prod the FS buff reliably. So if you don't have R5 in other words, right, if you don't have R5 Freedom Sword, you are better off using R5 Cinnabar Spindle for Albedo. But there is one point I want to bring out, is that if you consider how high C6 R5 Itto's damage is, and how many mobs / bosses can survive more than 1 burst, even R1 FS still has its value, right? Although it's only 1.4 to 2.5% better. And R5 values will be even better. It's 9 to 11% upfront on the first rotation. With a C6 R5 Itto, and given how high Itto's damage is, there's not much bosses that can survive more than that. So you pretty much can clear the content with 1 rotation, and that 1 rotation will stand to benefit greater from Freedom Zone. That's one thing to consider. But there are other caveats / conflicting issues for FS that are not that great, and we'll share those shortly. So first, let's look at C0 R1 figures first, weapon comparison figures first, before we talk about those issues. Okay, I think I understand why. Because I'm using this feature, it auto unhide some of my rows. Okay, so again, these are the damage figures for Freedom Zone together with, these are damage figures for Freedom Zone together with Itto, C0 R1 Itto. So when it comes to C0 R1 Itto, since Itto now deals lesser damage, R5 Cinnabar Spindle is actually better than R1 Freedom Zone, because your buff effect is smaller, right? Because your buff, the base that you are buffing, if you are buffing a C0 ER1 Itto versus a C6 R5 Itto, you are getting less out of your buff when you are buffing your C0 R1 Itto in terms of absolute figures, right? So that is why, if you only have C0R1 Itto, and maybe I shouldn't use the word only, because C0R1 Itto is not cheap as well. If you have C0R1 Itto, R5 Cinnabar Spindle is actually better than R1 Freedom Swan by 1.7 to 2.7%. Now R5 Freedom Swan can still be better than a Cinnabar Spindle, but it's only by 5 to 7%. Wow, right? And don't forget that, like what I said, Freedom Swan buffs, so the Freedom Swan's buff only lasts for the first rotation. You can't get it on the second rotation. Just how good is Cinnabar Spindle, man? So, like I said, putting things into perspective, let's compare the actual damage bar for Itto versus 2x the difference between CS and FS for C0R1 Itto. And this is the end result where, just in all the yellow cells, okay? The end result where we have here is not only one single cell is positive. Okay, only one single cell is positive. And that is with C6 Goro and a Math Stats combination. But you gotta understand that this Math Stats is really more for comparison. You are not going to be able to get Math C2 stats in the first rotation at all. There's no way to do it unless you waste so much time waiting for this. So this is not really practical. So in other words, we can conclude that none of them are better. So no permutation for Freedom Swan, be it R1 or R5, is better than Cinnabar Spindle when we take the rotations into consideration, which is taking them in pairs, because we said Freedom Swan's buff cooldown is too long. This is really an amazing testament to how good Cinnabar is. But just bear in mind that your R5 FS will still be better on the first rotation. Okay, in terms of overall. In terms of overall for the first rotation, R1 FS is actually worse than Cinnabar for C0R1 Itto. I don't even know how to describe this, man. I actually double checked my math for this, because the result was really surprising. So, but bear in mind that although C0R1 damage is not as high as C6R5, it's still very high for C0. Okay, it's still very high for C0. And only the new harder bosses can survive more than one burst of a C0R5. R1, sorry. So R5 Freedom Swan can still have its value. But there are other problems for FS that really gave me a headache, and I'm going to talk about them now. So, is Albedo Burst really required to proc FS buff reliably? I'm sure some folks may have doubts on this, so I'm going to go in detail here. If you don't use Albedo's Burst and you go off field and you proceed to use Goro's Q, Itto's Q, because that's what my rotation always do. We do all the setup before we go Goro Q and Itto Q. Think about the number of damage sources that are going to be happening. You have Itto that's dealing Geo damage every 0.5 seconds. And every 2 seconds from his Geo Construct Ushi, the little cute dancing bull. You have Goro dealing damage every 1.5 seconds through his Geo Collapse. You have the flat slot continuously applying its element as well. And finally, Albedo, who's dealing Geo damage, the fastest they can do it is every 2 seconds. How confident are you that Albedo will be the one triggering the elemental reaction in such a scenario? Personally, I have little to zero confidence. In fact, I should just say it's 0. I'm being polite here by saying I have little. It's actually 0 confidence that Albedo will be the one progging the elemental reaction when you have all this damage happening at a much faster rate than him. It's just not possible. There's just way too many sources. Okay? So, in my opinion, it's better to use his burst to reliably proc the second reaction. And because you have to use his burst, that delay in Itto's DPS comes in. Okay? Especially between rotations. I have a very big headache with C2 Itto and using burst on Albedo, regardless of whether Freedom Swan or not. I'll talk more about that too. So how about not using his burst? How about let's just recast his E to trigger the reaction? That's a very sound suggestion. And with the way the rotation for pure defense works, in order for Albedo to proc the elemental reaction, we will need to cast the flat slot, burst of talents, or burst of skill first, before Albedo's first E. Now if you remember my pure defense rotation, it's already optimized for the 4-second cooldown on Albedo's E. If you move the flat slot casting out before Albedo's first E, which means the 4-second cooldown have not started at that point in time, you're going to run into a situation where you have nothing to do until his cooldown is ready for you to recast. So that's not ideal, right? Of course, you can argue to say that, then in that case, don't use 4-piece Husk. Sure, but remember 2-piece Petra is not that great, right? There are other caveats to it. In some scenario, it's doing worse than 4-piece Husk. You can sacrifice your ability damage further, but what does that do? That again competes against our weapon comparison here, because we talk about the difference between FF and CS multiplied by 2 versus Itto's damage buff. Okay? You can do it. There's no stopping you, right? You can choose, if for some reason you want to make it work, you want to make this work, you can choose to use the recast E to be the one doing the proc for your second elemental reaction. I don't see any issue with that. It's just that you're sacrificing yourself because you're not trying to get the stats right. You're trying to ignore the 4-piece Husk stacks effect for the recast. But then again, why are you recasting E in that case? You're only recasting E because you want to get his snapshot, right? That's why I say Albedo has a lot of conflicting issues when it comes to his E, his snapshot, his burst, his C2 effect having to gain stats before it can properly scale off defense, and how Freedom Zone works for him as well. So yeah, I'm not gonna go more on that. But effectively, I hope it helps you guys see that I honestly tried my best to find a good way to reliably proc the second reaction for FS without using burst in the comp, where there's Itto, Goro, Albedo, and a flat slot that are all constantly applying Joe damage, or rather applying damage, and their elements. And I also don't recommend to cast Goro Q first, because you want to maximize Goro Q for Itto's Q. That's number one. Itto is your main DPS, not Albedo. Goro's Q may interfere with Albedo, triggering second reaction, and that's going to be worse off. You don't want to cast Goro Q before your Albedo recast, or before your Albedo's second elemental reaction. So yeah, if anyone can find a good way, please let me know. But it's not looking good at the moment in an Itto comp. Especially comparing value in terms of a C0 4-star weapon versus a C0 C2 with a R5 5-star weapon. FS really disappointed me with all these issues. And there's more. Now that we have established that burst is required for FS, we have to talk about the issue with using his burst. This applies to Hybrid as well, by the way. It takes up too much time against Itto's C2, where he only has 2.5 second downtime in a triple Joe comp, especially between rotations. Ultimately, whether this is an issue depends on whether Itto can get his burst back up in 2.5 seconds downtime, right? Because it sounds really ridiculous. It sounds really tough. But remember, he's in a triple Joe comp. All of the Joe damage, if they manage to trigger any particles, it's gonna give the full amount to all 3 of them. He's gonna be dishing out so much damage that he's gonna be getting particles and orbs left and right from enemy deaths, as well as HP thresholds on boss enemies like the Fatui Agent, Ruin Guards, Ruin Graders. There's so many of them. Okay? MiHoYo can't be so dumb as to design a C2 that can't be utilized most of the time. Okay? That's not MiHoYo. We should know by now how good MiHoYo is at designing stuff that is directly related to their profit. Okay? Let me repeat that. MiHoYo is very good at designing. I don't. Should I say just say constellations? It's not just constellations, right? It's designing weapons, constellation, their strategy in terms of releasing characters and weapons, etc. They're really good at that because all of these impact their revenue, and this is the area that they put the best effort in. I'm pretty sure. So I really think that his C2 is achievable. And if his C2 is achievable, using Albedo's burst is a bit no-no. It is quite disappointing. Now, let's do a final recommendation. I know it looks long, but like I said, this Freedom Swan really gave me a lot of headache. That's why there are going to be so many points. So in theory, Freedom Swan sounded like a great weapon to buff Itto's damage, but given the loss in Albedo's damage versus how good CS Cinnabar Spindle is for Albedo's damage, we actually fall into a situation where there are a lot of conflicting points that I've covered in this video, in the earlier part of it, but I'll summarize the points as neatly as I can. Okay? If you intend to get C0 R1 on Itto or lower, don't use Freedom Swan on Albedo. It's as simple as that. Unless you have R5 Freedom Swan and you want to see big PP numbers on your Itto, only in the first rotation. Only in the first rotation. It's like trying to do as much damage upfront as possible without caring what happens after. And it's not even better for your overall team DPS. It's actually worse off for your overall team DPS. It's really just to see bigger numbers on Itto, only on the first rotation. So I really don't recommend FS on Albedo if you intend to get C0 R1 Itto or lower. When I say or lower, it means lower than R1's Redhorn Stone Treasure. For example, Serpent Spine or the Whiteblind. Now, if you intend to get, and most probably any of the other 5-star weapons as well, because R1 Redhorn is probably going to is likely, very likely his BIS weapon. So if you intend to get C6 R5 Itto, if you intend to go all out for Itto, and you have R5 Freedom Swan, R5 Freedom Swan can give you approximately 20% boost on Itto's figures, which looks really nice. But it is only 9 to 11% boost if you factor in Albedo's damage as well. So it's like your boost actually cuts in half. It's a very nice illusion to see that big PP number when your Itto C6 R5 Itto is dealing damage that's buffed by R5 FS. But in terms of your overall team DPS, it's only about 9 to 11%. But it's still very nice, right? 9 to 11% is still better than Cinnabar Spindle. But it's only on the first rotation. For both the 20% boost and 9 to 11% boost, it's only on the first rotation. Once you factor in the second rotation not having FS buff, it's going to be worse, and I'll talk about that later. So the next point is if you intend to get C6 R5 Itto, but unfortunately you only have R1 Freedom Swan, and there's no Freedom Swan rerun banner yet, R1 Freedom Swan is going to give you 10% boost on Itto's figure, but only 1.4 to 2.5% boost if you factor in Albedo's damage as well. And again, only on the first rotation. It's really not good. Now, if you consider the fact that FS buff cannot be granted every rotation due to its cooldown, then the percentage figures above are worse off, and in actual fact, only R5 FS with C6 R5 Itto has a net gain in damage, which is the positive figures you saw earlier, the green highlighted cells. Only R5 FS with C6 R5 Itto gives you a net gain in damage. This is super wheel territory. Okay, but I have to be fair here. I can't be going all negative on Freedom Swan all the time. Basically, if there is a break between rotations, Example, you have boss cutscenes, you have traveling to next area, like while you're in Labyrinth Warrior, for example. Every combat you use your burst, you travel through a small little chamber to the next one, and you wait for the enemies to spawn again. In those scenarios, there is a chance that you are able to use the rotation every second, because like sometimes when after you clear the room, there's still rewards etc. to choose from as well, right? If you take your time to think about those, then your rotation will be ready. So FS buff, although I say that it cannot be triggered every rotation, but if there is a break of like 8 to 10 seconds, you basically can do it every rotation. It's just that I'm talking about a scenario where, let's say you're in Spiral Abyss and you finish your first rotation and the mobs are not dead. Those are the cases where you are not gonna get your FS buff. Okay? If you are doing content that can be cleared in one rotation, FS will do better than CS regardless. Because we're talking about one rotation, right? Well, except C0R1 Itto with R1 Freedom Zone. Okay? FS requires burst to reliably proc FS buff, and that will delay your Itto's downtime, especially if you have C2 Itto. And I just established that only C6 R5 Itto has a net gain in damage, so you should have C2 Itto if you want to use FS. But at the same time, you now have a conflicting issue where C2, you might negate your own effect of C2 because you want to cast burst on Albedo. So if it's not an issue to get C2 Itto's burst in 100% uptime with the reduced cooldown, which I doubt it will be because of all the reasons I mentioned earlier, the FS buffs are definitely not worth the delay in using Itto's burst. You should not waste your C2 effect. The difference being able to use Itto's burst on a 2.5 second downtime versus a 7 second downtime is huge if you are able to get the energy up order in time. Okay? The FS buff is definitely not going to be worth it. But again, this is provided you don't clear the content in one rotation. Now, I need to do a reminder. Some content can't be cleared in one rotation even if your damage is high or super OP because of forced phases, right? I mean, an example is like Ashtaha, Mechanical Array, or harder mobs that spawn in waves, or mobs like, say, the Ruin Sentinels, if they happen to always dig into the ground. I personally have experienced that before. That's going to waste your DPS time, and that's going to cause you not to be able to clear the rotation in time. So even as a wheel, even if you go all out, you go C6 R5, you have an R5 Freedom Zone, there still can be scenario where you can't clear the content in one rotation simply because of the mechanics of that challenge or that boss or whatever it is. Although, if you think about it, for Ashtaha it's not so bad, because he's going to waste time doing his cutscene, doing elemental infusion, and he's going to waste time doing the stomping on the ground. You're pretty much guaranteed your FS buff for all 3 phases of Ashtaha. So maybe Ashtaha is a bad example here, but I hope it brings you guys to understand what I'm talking about, like phases, forced phases. Okay? So to conclude, only C6 R5 Itto with R5 Freedom Zone on Albedo is worth using in terms of overall damage gain. And that highly depends on its C2. If its C2 can be achieved easily, which I think it can, I can't be sure until I try it out when Itto is released, even R5 Freedom Zone will not be worth it for C6 R5 Itto if that is the case. C0 Albedo with Cinnabar Spindle without using burst is likely the best overall option for Itto, especially if you have C2 Itto. If you don't have C2 Itto, I think using the burst is fine because of the duration. So I guess that is still possible in a scenario where you are not using C0 Itto, not using C2 Itto, you are using lower C1 or C0 Itto. you still can use PJC, Primordial Jet Cutter, with Albedo to use hybrid mode. Still doable. Still doable. But for Freedom Zone, it's not, because like I said, for Z0R1, Freedom Zone is not a net gain in damage. I am pretty disappointed with FS because of this, at least for Itto. But silver lining, if you like to see bigger numbers with your Itto, by all means go ahead and use your FS. I'll probably do a showcase with R5 FS as well, but I'll use CS eventually in the long term. Most likely I'll end up using Cinnabar Spindle eventually in the long term. As for whether I'll go C2 Albedo, I will probably do the constellation review and analysis in depth first before deciding. Alright, so that is the conclusion on Freedom Swan. Now down to the artifact recommendation, which is the last subject of this topic, or this video, sorry. If you really want to use Freedom Swan, 4-piece Husk is better than 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk, because 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk is only 1 to 2% better, but it comes with a caveat of not recasting E. The moment your E is damaged by enemies, 4-piece Husk will be better, because you're gonna need to recast with 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk. The only reason 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk is better than 4-piece Husk right now is because there's no need to recast. Okay? Now, my previous recommendation to go with 2-piece Petra, 2-piece Husk still holds as a placeholder option, but it's more important to go for 4-piece Husk ASAP for FS as well, just like with CS. So personally, I'm disappointed that FS on Albedo has such issues with it, especially C2, and especially... But I guess we should be happy that CS is so good that it's giving FS buff to Itto a run for its money. It's making such that unless you're a Giga Wheel, you see C6 R5 Itto with R5 Freedom Swan, you can't get a net gain. You only get a net gain in that specific combination. But like I said, let's try it out when Itto is out. Maybe Freedom Song will be good because most of the content we are able to clear in one rotation. Maybe that will be the case. But given all these caveats, all these issues, Freedom Song is not going to be a weapon I'm going to pull for specifically for Albedo in a Itto comp. I'll probably use it just for seeing bigger figures, but CS is probably going to be the better option. Alright, that's all from me for this video. Next video I will do PJC, hybrid build with Primordial Jet Cutter, and we can talk about whether that's a good option for Itto in an Itto comp for less than C2 or C2 and above. Okay, thanks everyone for watching. I know the video is a bit long, but it's because there's so much to talk about for Freedom Zone and its issues. Okay, if you like the content, remember the video and click subscribe for more. Bye.